Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
Hi, I'm Alexis Braun. I'm a visual artist, scholar, and doctoral student in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. I approach my research as a scholar practitioner with a background in printmaking and textile design. Today, I'll be sharing my essay titled Visionary Dialogues, Hilma of Klint, Rudolf Steiner, and the Spiritual Aesthetics of the Third Realm, dedicated to my professor, mentor, and friend, Robert McDermott. In his 1888 lecture, The Aesthetics of Goethe's Worldview, Rudolf Steiner presents art as a transformative spiritual practice, emerging at a moment when materialist tendencies were increasingly shaping cultural life. For Steiner, Goethean aesthetics offered a corrective to the fractures of modern consciousness, one capable of cultivating the essential stages of spiritual cognition: imagination, inspiration, and intuition. At its heart lies an impulse to reunite empirical observation with spiritual reality, not as abstraction, but as a basis for cultural renewal. Central to Steiner's vision is his notion of a distinct third realm, a mediating domain in which sense perception and spiritual idea are brought into a living relationship. This onto-epistemic dimension of aesthetic experience forms the conceptual ground for exploring the multidimensional relationship between Steiner's Goethean epistemology and the visionary practice of Swedish artist Hilma af Klint. I argue that af Klint's nature studies articulate a visual epistemology that enacts Steiner's Goethean third realm, a mode of cognition in which empirical attention and spiritual receptivity converge in a living, dynamic relation. Through the deliberate tension between naturalistic rendering and abstract diagram, af Klint makes visible the interplay of appearance and archetypal form, what Steiner understood as the idea appearing within phenomenal reality. In this way, her work cultivates a form of delicate empiricism, an aesthetic epistemological discipline grounded in place and practice. My initial encounter with af Klint unfolded within this lineage through a trinity of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Rudolf Steiner, and Robert McDermott. As a visual artist, I was first drawn to Goethe's method of delicate empiricism, deepened through Steiner's elaboration of those principles, and guided by McDermott to the 1986 exhibition catalog for the spiritual and art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the first major museum exhibition to present af Klint's abstract works 42 years after her death. As chance, or perhaps karma, would have it, I attended af Klint's 2018 record-breaking exhibition, Paintings for the Future, at the Guggenheim Museum in New York in the company of the McDermotts. Encountering af Klint's visionary oeuvre felt like crossing a threshold into the mysteries of spirit and nature, earth, and cosmos. Yet resonance alone, however profound, was only the beginning. Much like the spirals animating her images, af Klint's practice unfurled from mediumistic collaboration into a sustained and reverential engagement with the natural world, consistently seeking to mediate the visible and the supersensible. The precision of her academic training at the Swedish Royal Academy of the Arts, her experience in scientific illustration, and her visionary capacities all persist, reappearing in new constellations as her practice evolves. In my broader research, I present af Klint as an integral artist and visionary onto-epistemologist, an artist whose oeuvre constitutes both a visual language and a profound form of spiritual cognition, approached from within the conditions of its own emergence. Integral artistry names a practice that reunifies art, science, and spirituality, countering the fragmentation of modernity by grounding aesthetic work in a participatory ontology. Within this framework, images are imbued with inner intelligibility. They arise through co-creative engagement with the more than human world, participants in the very realities they disclose. In Steiner's extensive writings and lectures, Klint found conceptual and cosmological grounding for her own spiritual aesthetic investigations, not through extended personal dialogue, but through sustained engagement with his Goethean orientation and anthroposophical worldview. At the same time, as a student of several esoteric currents, Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, and Christian mysticism, she extended and transformed these teachings, forging a spiritually attuned relational aesthetic uniquely her own. Steiner first appears in Klint's notebooks in early 1908 when she records attending one of his lectures in Stockholm, marking the beginning of her sustained engagement with his ideas. Through his teachings, she encountered Goethe's scientific works, noting simply, Goethe begins where physics ends. Her initial visit to the Goetheanum in 1920 marked a lasting commitment. She became a lifelong member of the Anthroposophical Society, returning to Dornach to attend Steiner's lectures on art. His ideas remained foundational, offering a fertile epistemological and cosmological orientation in which her own visionary capacities could take shape. Taken together, these traces suggest that Steiner and anthroposophy remained a vital thread within the wider web of esoteric and spiritual influences shaping her artistic and inner life. Before proceeding, it's necessary to clarify Steiner's concept of the third realm, a cornerstone of his Goethean aesthetics and essential to the epistemological framework informing my articulation of Klint's integral artistry. Steiner identifies a crisis within modern consciousness, a split between the realm of the senses, where we encounter only the finite and the particular, even as he notes, our spirit strives for the archetypal, for the infinite and the immortal, and the realm of reason, where universal law and archetypal form reside. He gives voice to this crisis when he writes, "The inner content of the world is revealed to us only when the human spirit transcends this reality, breaks through its shell, and penetrates to the very kernel. The modern spirit finds no satisfaction in reality or in the individual thing, because only by going beyond it and recognizing what we revere as divine do we find what science addresses as the idea." For Steiner, this crisis marks the rupture inaugurated by modernity. Where the Greeks experienced art as an effortless continuation of nature, modern individuation fractured this unity, leaving sense and spirit estranged. Aesthetics thus emerges not merely as a theory of art, but as a response to this epistemic rupture, requiring the artist to consciously restore what once occurred unconsciously in the living exchange between self and world. For Steiner, art arises as a mediating space between these poles, what he calls the third realm, a realm in which the single thing, rather than the whole, represents the idea, appearing in such a way that generality and necessity are inherent within it. In this domain, idea and appearance can meet, neither dissolved into abstraction nor reduced to empirical fact. As Steiner writes, aesthetics must find its task in understanding art as this third realm. Only through a living connection to Goethe's way of seeing, he insists, does this mediating domain become perceptible at all. To disregard this way of seeing, Steiner warns, is to renounce the very foundations of our culture, to flounder in the mire without the will to rise to the luminous heights from which our culture's entire light shines forth. To perceive this realm requires a cultivated inner discipline and conscious receptivity. As McDermott notes, Goethe and Steiner are united in their affirmation of the positive roles that disciplined subjectivity, true individuality and enlightened volition play in the process of knowledge. As he writes, the individual is the most powerful and exact physical apparatus there can be for observing the natural world. These capacities name the inner orientation that makes the third realm perceptible, an orientation that Klint's practice repeatedly enacts rather than merely illustrates. Seen through this lens, Klint's nature studies can be understood as enacting what Steiner describes as the third realm, a domain in which empirical attention and formative idea converge within a single act of perception. In 2022, the Museum of Modern Art acquired Klint's Nature Studies, a portfolio of 46 sheets rendered in pencil and watercolor, comprising 114 observed subjects from 1919 and 1920. This year, MoMA presented this body of work publicly for the first time in Hilma of Klint, What Stands Behind the Flowers, an exhibition that deepens and extends existing scholarship by offering the most sustained focus to date on this facet of her practice. By foregrounding her iterative study and the interplay between naturalistic rendering and abstract diagrammatic form, the exhibition opens a new avenue for understanding the epistemological stakes of her late work. Here, the living world becomes Klint's primary partner, not as subject, but as participant in ways of knowing that are simultaneously empirical and spiritual. These works arise from sustained reverence, receptivity, and close observation, a participatory way of seeing in which empirical attention and imaginative cognition co-arise. As curator Jody Hopman observes, Klint linked each flower and diagram with a human emotion, characteristic, spirit, or state of consciousness. Here, Steiner's elaboration of Goethe's method becomes especially illuminating. He taught that when artists cultivate their observational capacities and grow aware of their own cognizing activity, they can begin to experience what he called the idea within reality. In this way, the resulting work is not a copy of nature, but a free expression of the forces that give it form. This dimension of Klint's practice was also profoundly place-based, grounded in her sustained immersion in the fields and forests surrounding her home on the island of Munsa. This shift from collaborative mediumship to a solitary yet deeply relational engagement with the living world marks a turning point in her artistic and spiritual development, rooted in a lived belonging to place. As she later wrote, when we turn our gaze towards the plant kingdom, it gives us information about the composition of our own being. In this sense, the nature studies are not only exercises in observation, but practices of participation shaped through daily encounters with an ecology that becomes both teacher, mirror, and interlocutor. Turning to sheet 3, a page that continues to draw my attention, we find European thimbleweed, Lombardy poplar, and goat willow rendered with botanical precision, each paired with an abstract diagram that Klint labels with the Swedish term riktlinjer. As Hopman observes, these diagrams function as paths forward or guidelines for what one should be aiming for. The spiritual state demonstrated by the flower is one to which humans might aspire. This becomes especially clear in the rendering of goat willow. A materials and methods study in the catalog notes that Klint's palette draws on Goethe's theory of colors: yellow as excitement and light, blue as negation and darkness, and green as their perfected union. Associations she further inflected into masculine, yellow, and feminine, blue valences. That polarity finds visual expression in the bright yellow pollen-covered catkins and in the alternating blue and yellow zigzag diagram, expressing what Klint described as the tree's fragmented power. A critical essay in the catalog describes the pairing of naturalistic drawing and abstract diagram as one that destabilizes the epistemic function of the figural drawings, generating a productive tension within the page. It is precisely this tension, this polyphonic coexistence of registers, that allows the works to reimagine both the vegetal realm and the science of botany itself. Within this dynamic relation, Steiner's third realm comes into view, not as a theory imposed on the image, but as a mode of perception embodied by the work itself. What matters epistemologically is the kind of knowledge that emerges through this conjunction. The naturalistic rendering alone would give us botanical classification, purely representational. The diagram alone would remain an abstract spiritualism, disconnected from material reality. However, together they generate a participatory mode of knowing, one in which the universal becomes perceptible within the particular, and the archetypal activity discloses itself through disciplined attention to the visible. This is not empiricism supplemented by interpretive fancy, but what Goethe and later Steiner understood as exact sensorial imagination, a cultivated capacity through which phenomena reveal their formative principles. The diagram does not illustrate a pre-existing spiritual truth. It is grounded in sustained, receptive presence to the plant's becoming. As Goethe wrote, there is a delicate empiricism that makes itself utterly identical with the object, thereby becoming true theory. Off Klint's aesthetic epistemology embodies precisely this capacity to perceive the living idea at work within reality itself. Philosophically, this does more than unsettle Cartesian dualism. It offers an alternative mode of knowing, one in which perception becomes a disciplined moral spiritual practice, and observation itself becomes a form of meditation, an ethic of attention. As I walk through the MoMA exhibition, I sense Steiner's Goethean aesthetics made visible, each sheet a living practice of the delicate empiricism that first struck me as revelatory nearly a decade ago. Each flower offered its particular form, each diagram gestured towards the archetypal, together enacting the mode of cognition Goethe and Steiner associated with a spiritually attuned humanity, one in which empirical attention and spiritual idea meet in reciprocal relation. Klint too oriented her work towards such a future audience. As biographer Julia Voss notes, she did not seek conventional artistic recognition, but hoped for an audience of seekers, viewers capable of receiving her paintings as an alternative to materialism, as thresholds opening into new thoughts and new feelings. Her writings described a spiritually permeable world, one that is mutable and responsive to consciousness itself. In 1919, the year she began the nature studies, she wrote, "The livelier the vibration of thoughts, the more flexible life on earth becomes. Anyone will be able to work on matter with their imagination." Standing before these works, I felt the resonance of an epistemic lineage long marginalized, now entering renewed public visibility through MoMA's curatorial lens. The significant lies not in institutional validation, but in cultural reception, a sign that contemporary culture continues to reach for modes of knowing that unsettle canonical formalism and exceed strict materialism, a reach sharpened by a moment marked by ecological crisis and epistemic fatigue. Against this backdrop, the recent acquisition of nature studies by the Museum of Modern Art, together with the scholarly contributions of what stands behind the flowers, marks an inflection point within an already unfolding trajectory in recognizing the epistemic seriousness of Klint's work. Its presence within MoMA's collection ensures that this body of work will continue to generate new scholarship, advancing conversations around the spiritual, ecological, and philosophical dimensions of her practice. Rather than inaugurating a rupture, MoMA's acquisition functions as a contemporary precedent, echoing and extending the path first opened by Maurice Tushman's 1986 exhibition, The Spiritual in Art, and inviting renewed attention to the esoteric and spiritual currents threaded through modernism, currents long consigned to the margins, yet increasingly vital for understanding our present condition. Klint's life and work embody Steiner's third realm, not as a metaphysical abstraction, but as a lived possibility, an embodied mode of perception in which the world discloses its formative principles to a consciousness capable of meeting it with reverence, receptivity, and care. By bringing appearance and archetypal activity into reciprocal relation, the nature studies portfolio gives form to a Goethean Steinerian method of knowing, one that grounds perception as a participatory epistemic act, uniting empirical precision with spiritual receptivity. Her work demonstrates that delicate empiricism is not merely a historical method, but a viable and contemporary relational practice, one grounded in sustained, situated attention to place. Through this practice, perception itself becomes an ethic of care, shaped by attunement, reciprocity, and responsibility towards the more than human world. In this way, Klint offers not only a way of seeing, but a way of relating, one that can reorient how we attend to the ontological depths. It is a way of knowing we currently need to cultivate if we are to imagine and inhabit more habitable futures. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.